everybody. This is our more fun version than Saturday morning cartoons. We have Saturday morning waterside chat with, as Saul mentioned, a couple of folks who have enormous nuggets of wisdom. I've worked with both David and Tom throughout the last few years, and we're really excited to hear more about their advice for you working at the intersection of data and social impact. Just to provide some context, since Tom flew in yesterday and didn't get to join us for our first kickoff, some of these folks just met each other and have been forming teams around the California Safe Drinking Water Data Challenge. Just to show of hands, if you've met somebody new over the last 24 hours and have been exchanging ideas on your projects. Everybody met somebody? Good. Excellent. So Tom has been a proponent of learning by doing throughout the years. He has a whiteboard that's quite famous from the Obama administration on all sorts of leadership hacks and different nuggets of advice. What would you start with for these folks who are trying to form new teams and work on things that matter?
Yeah, so a couple things. So one is a tagline that the computer science research community came up with. So beginning in 2010, when I was working for President Obama, we had a group called the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology. They did a review of the federal investment in information technology research and development and concluded that because this program had its origins in high-performance computing, that we were underinvesting in this emerging paradigm of computing that was more data-intensive than compute-intensive. So I started working with the computer science research community to say, all right, what would a research initiative that responds to that observation look like? And the tagline that the CS research community came up with was data to knowledge to action. And I think you've got the, some like data to wisdom hierarchy in your notes over there. So that's one thing that I think is really important, is this not just to say, gee, I have this great data and I'm going to be able to do this analysis on it, but really saying who are the individuals and organizations that, if you have some insights, is actually going to be in a position to act. So example from one of the projects that Eric is supporting, right now when refugees are admitted by a country, sometimes those countries will locate them in a random state or region. And so it turns out that if you take advantage about both individual characteristics of the refugee and the economic characteristics of the region, you can do a lot better than random assignment. So you can significantly improve the employment rates and level of economic and social integration if you do that. So that's the data is data about the refugee, data about the economic characteristics of the region. The knowledge is, what would be a better fit than random assignment, and then the action is that there's some government ministry that changes the way that they make that decision. So that's one thing, is really thinking of the end at the beginning and then doing sort of the backward chaining from that to say, what's the sort of data analysis that I should be doing? So that's one thing. The second thing is that I really think that the value of data science is going to be unlocked as we have more individuals and teams who are bilingual. That is, that they not only understand R and Python and stochastic gradient descent, but they also have a deep understanding of a particular problem. And in the absence of that, a phenomenon that you'll see is, I was talking to a Berkeley professor who was doing a synthetic biology startup, and he said, well, we recruited all these computer scientists, and they were really, really smart, but when we left them alone, they were analyzing the noise rather than the signal. Because there was all this sort of domain context that they didn't have about which was which. So that's really when I think that we're going to unlock the economic and societal and civic value associated with data science, is either at the individual level, in the same way that historically we said biology is becoming a more intensive discipline, and therefore we need computational biologists. So it either happens at the individual level or it happens at the team level. So those are the things that I think are really important. So the most sort of valuable thing to come out of a hackathon is the social practice that helps with the formation of those teams.
Absolutely. And when you said bilingual, I was thinking with the Global Climate Action Summit, we had everything in English and Spanish, and yesterday, I wish I had taken a picture of when we played the video and it started in Spanish and everybody's eyes were just like, oh my gosh, I had no idea that 1 million Californians lack access to safe drinking water. But you mean bilingual with R, Python, et cetera, plus the disciplinary, lots of different languages. Exactly. And I know David and I were pleased to host a translational data science workshop, and that theme came out as well. And that was actually hosted here at BIDS with the division and BIDS working together.
Could I explore a couple of thoughts in Tom's lovely answer there? So two thoughts. You touched on some of the engagements with large and sometimes national or global organizations. And one of the things that we've found in these conversations as we start to tie our student community and whatnot into some of these, from knowledge to action, in many cases, the formal bodies go through a process where the things they do, they need you to do a few really big things that can make a big difference, and they get a large number of proposals and select,
Right.
And part of what struck me, for example, in our Discoveries program, we have over 500 students that are, signed up, ready to go. Mm-hmm. And it does seem that there's another possibility here of modest investment in exploring many, many things, often grassroots.
Yeah.
And your thoughts of innovation coming from the careful, focused, big investment versus, lots of creative ideas spread across perhaps a very young population.
Well, I think that points to the value of open data.
Mm-hmm.
So if you have more organizations that are making data available in bulk downloadable, machine-readable format, then you have permissionless innovation, right? So there are things. There are incredible value that comes from analysis of data that's really hard to get to, and a great example of this is work that social scientists are able to do when they have access to IRS data. Because what they're able to do then is to say, we can link higher education data and IRS data, and we can figure out what are those universities that are having the biggest impact on economic and social mobility. So what are the universities that have people who start off at the bottom 20% in terms of income distribution and wind up at the top 20%? And that is incredibly valuable. But the process that allows an economist to get access to the IRS data is a fairly heavyweight process, right? And so there are constraints on the number of collaborations that the IRS can do as a result of that. And so if it is possible, if you can just say, this data is going to be open by default, then I think that is one of the things that can enable, sort of a long tail of student-led innovation, because they don't have to ask for anyone's permission. So I think we should be looking at opportunities for permissionless innovation.
Fantastic. And I know there was an exciting announcement with Schmidt Futures and Berkeley about data collaboratives. Would you like to elaborate?
Sure, yeah. So
about that?
Eric and Wendy Schmidt created a new organization called Schmidt Futures. And this was launched in the fall of last year. It has 3 main goals: supporting scientific research, leveraging technology to solve societal problems, and promoting shared prosperity in the United States. And one of the grants that they're providing to Berkeley is to engage students in identifying future opportunities for data collaboratives. And the idea with data collaboratives is that you have a partnership between an organization that has the data, a team that can drive insights from the data, and then individuals and organizations that can make better decisions as a result of that. And the hope is that because Berkeley students are very entrepreneurial, that you've created this infrastructure not only to engage people in computer science and statistics and math, but also it's a cross-campus initiative, and that there are all these connector courses that are looking at the intersection between data science and immigration, or data science and the criminal justice system, that Berkeley students at both the undergraduate and graduate level are going to have great ideas for the next generation of data collaboratives. And then not only prototype them, but hopefully make a compelling case for getting additional financial and in-kind support for that. So this is something that I routinely saw when I was supporting big ideas. I gave one group of students the whopping sum of $3,000. They used it to pass a student fee referendum that raised $1.7 million to green the campus. The principal undergraduate organizer got a fellowship from a venture capitalist to spread this model for another 10 campuses. So you can get this sort of tremendous ROI if you have a student, a team of students that is intrinsically motivated, and you can provide them with an artificial deadline, a small amount of money, tips about how to have influence without authority, connections to people on and off campus. You can create this virtuous circle between the results that they're able to generate and the ability to mobilize additional attention and resources and partners to support their idea.
David is nodding his head on the mobilizing.
Yeah, all of that. Yeah, so picking up on that and this moment here, so the California Safe Drinking Water Challenge, what is more key to life than water? Water is life.
Right.
And it seems that it's also sparking something that's in some sense uniquely Californian, this relationship between the state government, the University of California system, the local economy and the public sector. But curious your thoughts of, we're at a fireside on a water talk, so pardon the metaphor, in particular about safe drinking water, how you think this might spark inspiration in the community.
Well, I think one that I was talking with Raphael about is the important environmental justice dimensions of this. So is it the case that that low-income communities and communities of color are most likely to live in communities that have nitrates and other things in the water? So that's one big issue. Another thing, so I think that there are a set of use cases that we see emerge over and over again when people think about how do I use data science to create additional societal value. And one is, can we move to a predict and prevent paradigm as opposed to waiting until disaster comes and then trying to remediate that disaster. So I think that's one thing, is what are the opportunities to do that? So a good example might be lead poisoning, right? So that's one where there's actually no good treatment. So if a kid has lead in their bloodstream, it's too late. So that's an example where you want to move to this sort of prevention paradigm. Another is that you have this limited resource, you have some scarce resource, and you have to figure out how to allocate it. And you want to say, what's the best way to optimize that resource allocation? So let's say that the state has a limited capacity to do inspections to find out whether someone is violating various federal and state statutes with respect to clean water. And they only have N number of inspectors. How do they think about that? A third might be, how do we learn from variance in performance? So, for example, in the healthcare sector, there is thanks to things like the Dartmouth Medical Atlas, we know that there's a community right outside Cleveland, the home of the Cleveland Clinic, that is doing 3 times as many stent operations as Cleveland is. So you see in the healthcare area, you see both examples of overutilization and underutilization. And looking at variance in performance as a way of trying to identify those both sort of positive outliers and negative outliers. Nowcasting, the ability to use data so that people who are responding to, for example, a natural or man-made disaster have the ability to have a common operating picture of what's going on and make better decisions. The ability to drive continuous improvement. So if you think about why things are better now than they were in 1820, it's continuous improvement over a long period of time. If you get 2% improvements in productivity, the magic compound interest means that you double standards of living every 35 years. So the ability to use data to not necessarily make this quantum leap, but make things engage in continuous improvement. So I think that there are a set of use cases like that students should have in the back of their mind and have examples of lots of them. And then when they're engaging with people who know about water, to say, that might be an example of something where we could try to do X to use data science to address a water challenge.
Okay.
So in terms of the broader ecosystem, looking at this hackathon and this array of different things happening this week, it's the historic Global Climate Action Summit. 300 or more affiliate events going on. Mm-hmm. There's a number of those artificial deadlines and community engagement events that have been pasted on our calendar.
Sure.
It's the 5th anniversary of the Data for Good Exchange with Bloomberg and groups that we know on the data ethics space. We've got our West Hub All Hands meeting. We're going to Idaho next week. You've had so many demo days and data paloozas and events that you helped orchestrate through the administration. Do you have any reflections on the most useful outputs from those types of events and fact sheets?
Sure. So I think that there are a lot of times when people think about a meeting, they think about the meeting as an end in itself. And I also think about that it's also useful to think about a meeting as a means to some other end. And so one of the things that we used to do fairly routinely is to have a meeting that is far enough in the future so that you could use it as an artificial deadline to get things done, but not so far that it's like, that's like in the far future. What we would do is to have conversations with lots of different individuals and organizations to say, in this particular area that we're working on, if you could call anyone and ask them to do something, who would you call and what would you ask them to do? So the insight is that if you're trying to build a coalition, it's very difficult to do that unless you know what are the members of the coalition and what are the mutually reinforcing actions that we would like them to take. And sometimes there are particular organizations that can really move the needle in a particular domain. So a good example is when I was serving as one of the chairs for the Clinton Global Initiative, Walmart agreed to green their supply chain. They have 150,000 suppliers, and when they asked them to take some action, they're pretty responsive. So that had far more impact than if Walmart had written a check to an environmental NGO. So Bucky Fuller used to talk about trim tabs, and a trim tab is the thing that moves the rudder that moves the QE2. So what you want to be able to do is, in a particular domain, to figure out who are the specific individuals and organizations that have a trim tab that they have the ability to move, and then to engage them and saying, we want to create a platform that would be attractive for you to announce that you are doing X, Y, and Z. So the thought experiment that I used to pose to the members of my team is that you have a magic laptop, and the power of the laptop is that any press release that you write will come true. And what you have to do is to come up with a headline, which is a goal statement, several paragraphs that provide context, and paragraph level descriptions of who is agreeing to do what in order to achieve the goal. And once you have this vision, then occasionally you can create this shared hallucination that it's actually going to happen, which John Gage and I did in 1996 when we convinced everyone that there was going to be something called Net Day, and tens of thousands of engineers were just going to miraculously arrive in California schools and connect them to the internet. And John, much to the delight of the Secret Service, got President Clinton and Vice President Gore to stand up on a step ladder and pull Cat5 cable through a school in Ignacio Valley High. So sometimes they let the vice president go up. Okay.
Funerals and step ladders. Well, maybe riffing off that a little bit. That's the trim tab, that concentration, and then there's the other side, the butterfly effect. And at the beginning of this, you mentioned in biology startup, a team of folks off studying the noise instead of the signal. And at the same time, we see the other power is often the signal is the long-standing conventional wisdom, and the focus,
signal in the noise.
and that often the most important insights are what's being thrown out. And there's a long history. Much of pharmaceuticals grew out of the waste products of dyes, right?
Right.
So how do we also keep an eye on that? And in some sense, this is part of what's behind the pay attention to the variance, not the mean, is that often it's in the periphery that the profound breakthroughs may happen, especially in the change from very well organized, structured, solution-centric data collection and the kind of broad, amorphous, indigenous data that's more of the native situation today.
Yeah. So I think both are useful, and I think one question is whether there are things that you can do that allow these things to occur organically without any sort of central decision. So a good example would be those companies, and I think 3M started it. They say if you get a day a week to pursue projects that you think are interesting, not that your management is telling you to do. I think also similarly, like empowering students to say that if you have ideas of your own, then we should give you a pathway in order to be able to explore them. So I think the gardening metaphor applies here. Like how do you create the sunlight and the nutrients in the water that allows some of those things to occur organically without in a bottom-up way, without the center having to say, oh, you should go off and do X.
Organic
But
art
I
is
bet
very apropos for Berkeley.
Yeah,
Saturday
but
chat.
but I want to turn the question around and ask you what approaches have you seen be effective to have innovation emerge at the periphery as opposed to the core?
So I think some parts of it have been the bringing in of perspectives, sometimes naive perspectives, can be very helpful.
A beginner's mind?
Sometimes it's that, or in many cases, it's the perspective from a different field.
Yep.
And that can be quite sophisticated and nuanced and reasoning, but of a different form then you have those conversations, oh, I never thought of it that way.
Right. We just had an anniversary for Schrodinger's What is Life? So that's a good example where a physicist made an interesting contribution to thinking about biology.
Are you willing to take a question from the audience?
I'm willing to take more than one question from the audience.
Oh, excellent. We're not live streaming, we're just recording. So. Any questions for Tom?
Looks like we have one there.
Yes, please.
But it's a very unpleasant topic, or very difficult.
These guys don't shy away from difficult questions. Go for it.
So maybe you're familiar with the example that I'm thinking of right now of the Amsterdam City Council before the Second World War, collecting very precise data on the population. And they just so happen to have also very detailed information on who was of Jewish ancestry.
Right.
So at the time it was very innocent
Right.
data collecting, and then of course it was a perfect data set, like for the Nazis to
Right.
then know they had to. So we had very, like, it seems to me, so I'm coming from particle physics where, particles, are not suffering, so
Right.
they don't have any.
That we know about, right?
Oh, that's interesting. So, I have no idea of the ethics. I mean, I never had to deal with
Sure.
the ethics of data analysis.
Yes.
But, coming here as a person and see other topics, then immediately these things emerge.
Yeah.
So, we were discussing yesterday with Rafa, for example, that, what at a naive level, for example, even later in the work, you say, okay, of course it's better to know, right? But it's better for everyone to know because there are very severe health consequences. But at the same time, there might be some people who would say, okay, maybe I'm the mayor of a small town, then I'm, if this word gets out, then people will leave, and
Right.
then my town will die. Or
It's not just small mayors. There are large mayors who also don't want to know because then they'll be on the hook for cleaning it up.
I'm approaching this
Yes.
at a very naive level,
Yeah.
just to illustrate the problem. Or this healthcare data, right? So if you say, okay, there's a much larger incidence of certain type of cancers, for
Yep.
example, in one area, this is of course very useful to investigate what are the causes of this cancer, but I don't know, like medical insurance companies might use this data to simply charge more of those people living.
Yep.
So as a policymaker, who has the responsibility here? Like, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah. So different people have different types of responsibilities. So I think so policymakers have a responsibility to say, is there some action that the government needs to take, right? So for example, we say everyone has to drive on the right-hand side of the road. We don't say, well, if you want to drive on the left-hand side of the road, then that's your choice, right? So the government has a role to play in establishing the legal policy and regulatory framework. I think that one of the challenges that the government has oftentimes is that that technology can evolve more rapidly than law, policy, and regulation could keep up. But I think policymakers definitely have responsibility to say, once we've identified problems, to say, is there something that we need to do, that the government needs to do to address that, so that we're not only sort of trying to maximize the benefits associated with technology, but we're also trying to understand and manage the risks. So, for example, the government created a law called HIPAA, which is about trying to protect the privacy of personally identifiable medical information. And I'm not saying it's a perfect law, but I'm saying or the government passed a law that says you can't do discrimination on the basis of someone's genetic makeup. So if I, as an employer, find out that you're susceptible to this particular disease, I don't have the ability to say, I'm not going to hire you as a result of that. So I think that there is a responsibility for policymakers to understand the potential risks and to address them. There is a debate about when you do that, right? So the Europeans are more likely to support the precautionary principle, that is, to shift the burden of proof to industry to demonstrate that something is safe before they're allowed to develop it. And the U.S. is more likely to wait until there's demonstrable harm before doing something. And obviously, that policymakers also take a risk-based approach, right? So if something is really risky, like a new drug, then the FDA says you need to demonstrate safety and efficacy before we're going to allow you to market the drug. But I think there's also a responsibility for universities in ensuring that students have experience with these. And so there's one four-year college where the professors are taking all of the exercises that students have to do for software engineering, data structure, and algorithm courses, and picking examples that raise ethical issues. So so let's say that the thing is develop an algorithm for doing resume sorting, and then in that context of that, say, what are the different societal consequences of making different design decisions with respect to these types of algorithms? And then foundations are trying to create resources for engineers and product designers. There's one called Ethical OS, which is definitely worth checking out. And what this does is it provides a taxonomy of all of the unintended consequences associated with technologies. And say, like, the City Council of Amsterdam obviously did not say, well, what if we're invaded by a genocidal power? So obviously some things are more difficult to predict than others. But if you look at enough historical examples, history doesn't repeat itself, but sometimes it rhymes. And so there are a set of exercises that engineers and product developers can say, what are these sort of negative consequences that were not intended but are maybe second order effects from the technology? And can we start thinking about those at the design stage? So I think that that's a useful thing as well, is how do you provide a rich set of examples that can inform engineering and product development.
Absolutely, it's a global conversation, and that Omidyar Foundation's Ethical OS that just came out is definitely a resource to check out. There's also Data for Democracy, which many of us have worked with, who were part of the California Safe Drinking Water Data Challenge, and specifically looking at some of the questions to help navigate these issues.
Actually, if we could just stay that question for a second more. The framing was interesting, starting from particle physics as something devoid of social ramifications, which, oh my gosh, talk about something that has had such profound social implications. And germane to water, our national policy bodies, in some sense, for decades were setting off nuclear explosions in Colorado as an effort towards peaceful applications of the technology for fracking. Fracking is not a new thing, and it was the impact on water, isotopes and so forth, that put an end to fracking for 20 or 30 years till we had different technology. So I think the other is all things we do have these many sides. And so, as in addition to the roles of various policymakers, I think it's also incumbent on us to recognize there is no exploration, there is no inquiry, there is no advance that doesn't also have these many other aspects of context and ethics. And how do we make that, in fact, a part of everything we do, rather than hoping it's my part that somehow will be isolated or devoid. And think about the experiment that we as a species are carrying out. We have no idea how the kind of existence in a connected world is going to influence the perception and sense of truth, and where physical and virtual are interwoven, nor can we stop the society from moving ahead in some forth, because the world, we can't just replay it. So I think these questions really are things we have to take up every day.
I think Saul had a...
Yeah, please.
So in fact, I was following exactly this thought, which is, I think I understand a little bit how the cultural shifts in, let's say, a university environment can address this kind of problem. And I also understand how a little bit, even some of the the headline policy issues can be addressed this in a government setting. The place I'm less familiar with, and I'd be curious because I know that you've bridged this a little bit, is what happens in the culture of the entrepreneurial investment technology world? Because clearly, in our society at least, we've been taking advantage of the fact that they drive a lot of the innovation.
Yeah.
And so, in some sense, it would be really interesting to hear what kind of cultural shifts can happen there or have happened there that allow them to be a first line of defense, as opposed to everybody else being the line of defense against them.
Yeah, so we're seeing that in some high-tech companies with respect to the employers, because they actually have the employees. So the employees, because of the scarcity of talent, have leverage. And you're seeing a number of instances. Microsoft, for example, said, we're not sure that we want Microsoft to be the technology vendor for ICE in the current environment. Or we think that before the company proceeds and makes this decision, that there needs to be a consultative process in which the employees are genuinely engaged. One of the issues associated with companies saying, our mission is not just to make money, it's to change the world, that the employees are going to take that seriously. And then if they see the company that they work for taking actions that diverge significantly from that, then some fraction of them are willing to hold them to account. So I'm not saying that's the answer, but I'm saying that it is the employees recognizing that they have a voice, and particularly those that have in-demand skills.
Do you know whether the fiduciary duties of the boards allow for this kind of thing today?
There's a big debate over this, and there is a lot of pushback on the notion of shareholder primacy, which is that the sole fiduciary responsibility of a firm is to maximize shareholder value. I think what some people would say is that a firm needs to worry about its reputation because the consequences of having a bad reputation are customers may not buy their products or services, and the very best employees that have lots of options may not want to work there. And then you also have an increasing number of investors that not only want to get financial return, but want to make investments in ethical firms. So, I would say that there's a debate about that, and some leading politicians are introducing legislation that would fundamentally change corporate governance. We now have the creation of new forms of corporations like public benefit corporations. So Kickstarter, for example, reincorporated themselves as a public benefit corporation because they said, our goal is to advance creativity in the arts. It is not to maximize shareholder return. So if you're investing that, you should know that, right? So I think one issue is you shouldn't take an investor's money under the notion that you're going to maximize ROI and then do something else. Everyone should know from the beginning, we want to make money, we want to be profitable so that we can grow, but we're trying to balance multiple competing values, and if they're in tension with each other, shareholder return is not going to trump everything else.
Sean, who is actually one of our discovery research students working on the water topic.
So in my data ethics class, the first reading we do is about the big data report released by the Obama administration in May of 2016.
Yep.
And it does outline a lot of challenges, and it does seem like the rhetoric behind it calls upon the industry essentially to solve these challenges. But as we can see, moving forward, that many of these challenges that we're facing can't simply just be solved through industry or expect industry to regulate itself. So where is the role in policymakers in regulating how data is used, and specifically data privacy? And how can we play off of how we see the EU putting regulation on data privacy through the GDPR?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's interesting. because different US companies are taking different approaches to that. So some are trying to cordon off the impact of the GDPR so that it doesn't affect their entire operation. And others are saying, well, if we're going to go up to that level of privacy protection for Europe, why don't we just do it on a global basis, and maybe the compliance costs will be lower. I think that I think what the U.S. government has to figure out is, do we think that it makes more sense to have a blanket approach, that is, have something like GDPR that sort of covers all data processing, or do we want to continue to take a sector approach where we say there are certain types of information that are really important, and in those areas we're going to pass legislation like HIPAA, and then also, is there an interplay between self-regulation and the government? So, for example, the industry engages in some self-regulation, but some body like the Federal Trade Commission is providing some backstop. So you're basically saying, if you pledge to do X and you didn't do it, then you may have committed fraud, right? So I think one of the things that people are concerned about self-regulation is whether it's toothless. And so you can imagine something where industry and civil society are working together on the development of norms so that you can move at the speed of business. But once they say, I'm signing up to meet those norms, that there are consequences for knowingly and willfully violating those norms. So that what's the interplay between the law and soft law, basically?
Well, thinking about the law and legislation, who in Washington right now do you think has the focus on the value of data? Because, really what we hear is former Obama administration DJ Patel, former chief data scientist Megan Smith. So we hear a lot of former people in the whole space of data science.
Yes.
Who do you point to and say, these people still get it and can influence legislation?
So, I think that at the level of the science agencies, I think that there is actually a fair amount of continuity in terms of the leadership. So Francis Collins, who's a big promoter of data science in the context of biomedical research, Franz Cordova, head of the National Science Foundation, has made data science one of NSF's priorities. So they're at the level of a lot of the science agencies, there's been a lot of continuity in terms of the leadership. So I think the answer to that is like a lot of things, is it depends.
Savannah has a question?
Yeah. So you have a very impressive career in technology, whether it be
Mm-hmm.
White House,
Mm-hmm.
Cal, or Schmidt Futures.
Mm-hmm.
With the ever-changing and nebulous field that is technology and data, what is your advice for someone who's just starting off in the very beginning of their career, like me and other people?
Asking for a friend.
Asking for a friend. Yeah. So I took a particular career path that I'm not saying like I would recommend to everyone. It just so happened that it worked out for me. So the way I got started in policy is that I volunteered for a presidential campaign. I worked for a part of the campaign called the Issues Department. And so this is like boot camp for people who want to understand public policy, because every day or every other day, you're having to learn about some new issue, because you're getting the candidate ready for debates. You're trying to figure out what their platform should be and writing position papers. You're managing a large network of outside advisors. You're trying to figure out which of the hundreds of questionnaires that various outside groups are sending you the candidate should answer. You're briefing the candidate as they go around to different parts of the country so that they'll know what are the issues that you're likely to get asked about when you go to, this part of the country. And so what you learn is not so much about any one particular issue, but you learn how to say, what are the most important things for someone to learn about issue X when they're trying to make a decision about it? So that was a set of skills that was really that was useful to me, because I have not specialized in any one particular area. So I've worked on everything from the President's Brain Initiative to getting more young boys and girls excited about STEM, and the White House Science Fair, to giving every agency the ability to support incentive prizes for up to $50 million. So my role has been finding individuals and organizations and teams that have a really interesting and potentially important idea, and figuring out what I can do to serve as a force multiplier for that. So I think one key thing for me is that one of the things that I observed about myself is I have the ability to get excited about other people's ideas. And if you have that capacity, then the number of things that you can engage in goes up exponentially. And this is something that Bill Joy talked about. He said, no matter who you are, most of the smartest people work for someone else. So as opposed to saying, okay, I'm going to think really hard until I come up with some novel idea, and I over the course of my career, I'm going to flack that one idea. You can the number of things that you can get involved in if you have the capacity to also get excited about other people's ideas goes up pretty significantly.
And we're so excited that you're excited about the water challenge enough to spend your Saturday morning here. In the interest of time, I know you all are counting down. You have 7 hours left before project presentations. We'll wrap up the chat, but Tom is going to be here for a little bit longer if you have any additional questions for him. So if you could join me in thanking both David and Tom and Saul.
And Meredith.
And John.
Yeah, and Meredith.
Everyone.
Thank you.